"Get your dirty hands off that counter, kid." The words cut through the hum of the bank like a thrown stone. Conversation folded inward. A woman steadying her handbag froze mid-step. The clicking of polished shoes from the concierge desk seemed to fall out of rhythm. Jamal Williams's hand hovered over the cool slab of marble, the skin of his knuckles bright where the fluorescent light caught them. He was 13, wrapped in a hoodie that had seen better winters. He smelled faintly of laundry soap and the lingering steam of the oatmeal he'd eaten in the morning. For a second, the world narrowed to the pitch of that voice. Cold, precise, performed for an audience. And the way the man behind the counter, Bradley Hutchinson, arranged his mouth like someone shaping a headline. Jamal had rehearsed how this might go 1,000 times in the small hours, when the apartment was quiet and his laptop hummed like a distant ocean. He had rehearsed manners, documents, answers. He had not rehearsed shame broadcast on a Tuesday morning beneath chandeliers. He looked up, and the whole bank seemed to lean in. Hutchinson's face was a study in smirks and polished lines. His security guard, Frank Morrison, filled the little hallway like a shadow adjusted to the proportions of the room. They had already decided that Jamal's presence needed a lesson. "Sir," Jamal said, voice small enough that it might be mistaken for politeness. He slid a plain card across the counter, his driver's permit, the paperwork from Tech Vision Solutions, the email with the licensing terms, a printed copy of the patent certificate that still smelled faintly of fresh toner. He had carried these things like armor, careful not to crease them, feeling simultaneously proud and ridiculous. "ID, please." Hutchinson didn't reach. He pointed, the clerk's hand theatrically hovering above the laminates. "And what is this supposed to be? Some kind of joke?" It was happening in public. It was the bleached, slow-motion kind of humiliation that turns private fear into communal entertainment. Smartphones lifted like crows. A woman behind Jamal's shoulder pressed record. A teenage boy barked a laugh. Someone whispered a joke about the audacity of a kid walking into a bank with money. Jamal's hands shook. The $2.4 million he'd watched post to his account overnight was a number that had felt abstract on his screen in the quiet of his bedroom. It had been a validation of 2 years of nights bent over code, of tutorials and forums, and a midnight breakfast of oatmeal and coffee on his mother's shift nights. It was, in his mind, a way out. Of overdraft notices and the heat-ridden apartment, a means to secure his little sister's violin lessons, to patch holes the landlord insisted were cosmetic, a way to repay a string of favors and to keep his mother from working the double shifts that frayed the edges of her smile. He explained carefully, the licensing agreement. He had created an algorithm that automated a small but crucial function in a surveillance stack used to optimize camera feeds. Tech Vision had offered a licensing deal after a brief but intense back and forth. The patent had been filed. The wire had cleared. He tried to put the words in order, so they would make sense to the people watching, to the people who had already decided that a hoodie equals a threat. Hutchinson brushed his explanation away with a laugh meant to be broad and authoritative. "We don't accept deposits like that from kids," he said. He said it loudly, as if the clause were in some invisible bank handbook that his position permitted him to quote. "You're either a con artist or you're lying." The security guard moved a step closer. A line of customers behind Jamal shifted like an audience waiting for the next act to start. In a litany of looks, there was curiosity, some discomfort, some open scorn. From the corner of the room, Jamal's mother watched. She had arrived late, hair in a bun, a shift tag still clipped to her shirt. Her face was an island of calm that drew quick, anxious tides when Jamal's name came out of Hutchinson's mouth like a verdict. At home that morning, Jamal had woken to the bluish light of his laptop screen before the alarm. The apartment was small and effective at preserving sleep. It protected the hours he stole for study. His mother had left a note on the fridge. "Mom's shift tonight. Be home by 8. Take Anita to practice. Love you." The handwriting had a hurried tenderness, crowded loops, a missing dot on an I. He had opened his email and there it was. Subject line, "Licensed Agreement, Tech Vision Solutions." The message had been warm and sanitized, the kind of corporate voice that folded into boilerplate praise. They'd called him a visionary, they'd attached the contract, and a second email had included the wire confirmation. Funds posted. Account credited. The number glowed on his phone like a foreign star. $2,400,000. Sorgi, $2,400,000 in the account that until last night held enough for pizza and a new pair of headphones. He'd printed everything. It was one of those acts of reverence that mixed disbelief with ceremony. The patent certificate, the email trail with time-stamped exchanges, the redacted version of the licensing contract with the TechVision letterhead, the bank's SMS telling him, "Incoming wire has cleared." He folded the documents into the pattern of his hoodie's inner pocket and set out, hands steady for the first block of his life that felt like a map to a different country. Back in the bank, the man at the counter didn't believe maps drawn by kids. Jamal handed over his paperwork again. He kept his voice measured, careful. "I want to move funds. I need to arrange a withdrawal and set up accounts to make sure my family's covered." Hutchinson smirked in the way a man smirks when he believes a moment is entirely under his control. He leaned forward, palms spread, as if the marble itself belonged to some aristocracy of confidence. "Your name," he said. "Jamal Williams," Jamal replied. The name landed in the air like a coin. For a sliver of time, the bank's noise returned to its earlier rhythm, the softening of lives going on parallel to Jamal's unraveling. But then Hutchinson's lips curved differently. There was, briefly, an almost imperceptible shift in his expression, as if some inconsequential gear had clicked. He flicked his eyes toward the screen where Jamal's account information sat buried in rows of numbers and labels. He clicked with a practiced hand. The screen refreshed. Everything that followed would later be sliced and looped in clips, the way the smirk faltered when text resolved into a number, the audible intake of breath from the woman with the handbag, the slackening of a few jaws. But in that infinitesimal moment it was still a private recalibration, a human being adjusting the script he'd been authoring for himself minutes earlier. Hutchinson's finger hovered above the keyboard. He wasn't looking at Jamal so much as at a name. Jamal Williams. The words on the screen were simple and impartial and utterly consequential. Somewhere in that string of characters was the fulcrum between assumption and reality. Outside the bank's glass facade, the city around them kept moving. A delivery truck backed into a loading bay. A bus hissed to a stop. A child in a yellow jacket tugged a parent's sleeve, pointing at a poster on a lamppost. Inside, a crowd held its breath like a single unwilling bell. This is where the cameras began to exist. A woman's smartphone recorded from the bench. A teen streamed on a handheld, "Yo, look at this!" The clip. The moment became a lens. People moved closer for better angles. Jamal felt the prick of 1,000 tiny cold insects. He shifted his weight, resisting the instinct to flee back into the half-light of his life. When Hutchinson finally spoke again, the barbs were finer, practiced. "We typically require a guardian present for minors," he said. "You understand, don't you? Protocols." "My mother is here," Jamal said. He spoke his mother's name, steady but worn, like a rope. Hutchinson allowed himself a small, performative chuckle. "You expect me to just hand over checks? Move money? We have rules, kid. This isn't Monopoly." At that, Frank Morrison reached out and took Jamal's printed patent like a prop in a play, palms broad and authoritative. He turned the paper over as if it might reveal a trapdoor. A scuff from his shoe grazed the corner of Jamal's laptop bag. It was careless, not violent, but the intention thudded in Jamal's chest like a drum. He tried to retrieve his things. Morrison's hand clamped down, not tight enough to bruise, but tight enough to tell Jamal what was assumed, that whatever pocket of privilege a marble counter suggested did not belong to him. From the lobby, someone laughed. Not a light laugh, but a sound that wanted a cadence, a title. The boy with the live stream leaned in, his face inches from Jamal. "Bro, how did you get 2 million?" he asked, a smirk that tasted of both curiosity and cruelty. "Gonna buy a car?" Jamal swallowed. He thought of the nights hunched next to the glow of the laptop, rewriting functions until they bent into something useful. He thought about the first line of code he had ever written that worked. That moment of small, private triumph. He thought about his mother's steady hands as she refolded his lunch in the microwave. the way she'd hummed the same refrain when juggling shifts. He thought of Anita, his 8-year-old sister, asleep with violin at the edge of her bed. "How did you get here?" someone asked from the line. A voice with an audience. Jamal's answer was the kind that destabilizes prejudice: small, precise, factual. He explained the patent briefly, the licensing language, the signature line where TechVision's logo sat like a stamp. He explained in the way people do when they need someone to believe a truth that seems improbable, slowly, insistently, with evidence. But evidence has its own politics. It requires a language to be believed. It needs a person in power to translate it into permission. Hutchinson didn't translate compassion. He translated spectacle. He rang the bell to call in a manager from compliance, and then, with performative seriousness, he dialed the police. The call was almost canned in the way Hutchinson phrased it. They were suspicious of a possible fraud and needed assistance verifying identity. He used the term protocol as if to cover every human thing he was about to do. Officer Davis arrived 5 minutes later with the sort of authority that wears like armor. He moved with the purposeful staccato of someone who had learned his cues. His uniform was neat. His badge caught the bank's light like a challenge. He asked questions that were already answered. "Who do you work for?" he said to Jamal, voice flat as the floor tiles. "Where did you get the money?" Jamal answered with the same quiet precision he'd kept all morning, but the questions were not shaped to find truth so much as to assert suspicion. Officer Davis leaned forward as if Jamal might be so volatile that leaning would provoke a confession. Officer Kim, a partner the bank had called as backup, arrived afterward. Kim's approach was different, quieter, less theatrical. She listened as office chatter tried to build a narrative. She checked the names on the paperwork, the dates on the emails, the patent number that Jamal had learned to recite like a litany, a string of digits that proved the work's uniqueness. She noted the letterhead of TechVision. She made a call. The presence of an officer did not silence the crowd. If anything, it gave them something to watch that felt edgier. A man near the ATM filmed with a steady hand. His screen would later be reposted and remixed into a dozen versions. Someone else shouted, half joking, about cameras catching con artists. Hutchinson, feeling himself at the center of an unfolding story, raised his voice. "We can't just hand over money. I'm doing my job. You're not the first kid to try this." "You can look at my account," Jamal said, the words finally rebelling out of him. He pointed. "It's in my name." Hutchinson leaned back, irritated and briefly uncertain. He had begun the day believing that a certain posture would protect him. He had not planned for the possibility that what was on his screen might puncture that posture. The bank's computer systems are built to be dull and bureaucratic. They refuse grandiosity. They show balances and histories and transaction IDs. They print statements, and they freeze when networks hiccup. But they are also instruments of fact. When the teller refreshed Jamal's account screen, the balance sat in tidy black numerals. $2,400,000. Underneath, in the same font, the account name, Jamal Williams. It was a simple visual, numbers and letters in a grid. But for the crowd, digital absolutes have the power of gospel. Hutchinson's face, which had been a mask of performance, became an expression that tried to hold both surprise and recovery. For a moment, there was a tremor in the choreography of the room, like dancers who have missed a cue and are searching for rhythm. The phone glare did the rest. Someone's live stream peaked in viewers. One clip was shared, then reshared, and a dozen other hands raised phones and followed suit. The audio capture caught Hutchinson's earlier words and rewound them into the context of the screen's plain truth. "Get your dirty hands off that counter," played against the money it had been spoken about. The cognitive dissonance was immediate, a soundbite that had now become evidence of an exposed cruelty. Officer Davis, who had been leaning into an interrogation stance, felt the room tilt. He had been trained to notice risk. In training, risk is presented as a set of behaviors and patterns. The image of the hoodie as threat is a pattern that had been reinforced in lectures and incident reports and coffee room gossip. But a phone clip of numbers is another sort of pattern, arithmetic and documentation that undercuts hunches. He muttered into his radio and then looked up. The angle of his head changed. He called his sergeant. Officer Kim held the printed patent, tracing the embossed seal with a thumb. In the periphery, Jamal's mother moved to stand in front of him as if presence could be a shield. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply put a hand on his shoulder with that weary, exacting protectiveness of someone who had taught another to read through the ache of the world. "We did everything right," she said quietly. Not to the room, to Jamal. It's easy to forget, in the small theater of a local bank branch, that bureaucracies are fundamentally made of people and systems that often talk past each other. Here, the narrative of law enforcement, the narrative of a bank's duty to prevent fraud, and the narrative of a child with improbable funds intersected in a way that made spectacle inevitable. Each actor moved to protect his own version of truth, which is to say, no one in the room had the same priority. Hutchinson had a reputation to maintain. Frank Morrison had a rule book and the muscle memory of controlling bodies. Officer Davis had a checklist of risk. Jamal had a fragile map of a future he didn't want to see redrawn by humiliation. His mother had a lifetime of having to choose between indignity and safety. The onlookers wanted drama. Their smartphones wanted content. Phones hummed. A single feed, shaky, breathless, first person, would travel farther in 10 minutes than any of them could move. Comments would stream in. Where was his guardian? Was this staged? How does a kid get that much money? The clip's caption would be a blade that could cut any narrative open. Kid with millions. Scam. The bank manager called for the corporate fraud hotline. He used words like alert and suspicious activity, as if those words could close the gap between prejudice and proof. The line to headquarters was slow. The person on the other end had an official voice and asked qualifying questions that sounded suspect to Jamal, and precise to Hutchinson. Account verification, source of funds, supporting documentation. Hutchinson read the documents like a man reading fine print for a clue he wanted to find. He read mail headers, patent numbers, line items that to some might read like specialty shorthand. He pretended, for performance, to be the arbiter of truth. He might have believed that checking the boxes and following procedure would protect him from any accusation. There was a moment when the teller screensaver flashed a local news headline, a feed that had nothing to do with the clerk's shift, and the room's attention was yanked to two different realities. It showed a different kind of validation, one that moves slowly, in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in the back offices of banks. That is a slow gear. The bank's internal checks are an attempt to mechanize judgment. But this morning, the faster instrument was the smartphone. Within moments of Hutchinson placing the call, clips were already finding anchors in the social universe. An influencer reposted the boy's face with a snide caption. A local political commenter re-recorded Hutchinson's words over a montage of the teller resetting the printed patent on the counter, as if to underline how a moment of prejudice becomes a pattern worth discussing more widely. It would be naive to say evidence always wins. The morning made that painfully clear. Evidence had to be seen, interpreted, and validated by the right people, and sometimes the right people are simply absent. For Jamal, evidence was a pile of printed documents and a bank SMS. For others, the shape of his hoodie elbowed them into a narrative that needed no proof. When Officer Davis stepped forward to conduct a formal ID check, he did it with an expectation of tension. He read Jamal his rights in a voice that felt rehearsed and denotatively ominous. You don't have to answer questions, but it may help us understand. Jamal complied. He handed over his permit. He answered. The questions began to constrict, like the sides of a shoebox. Where did you learn to code? Officer Davis asked, as if skills could be proof of intent. Online tutorials, forums, classes at the community center, Jamal said. Who do you live with? My mom and my sister. Do you have anyone representing you? No. The term representing hung over the exchange like a verdict in weight. Officer Davis's posture suggested an escalation. Frank Morrison loomed. Hutchinson's smile was recovering. Inside Jamal there were calculations too. He thought of the patent's embossed seal and the many nights he'd used a coffee spoon as a stylus on a battered tablet. He thought of the email from TechVision that had called his work innovative. He thought of the bank notification. Incoming wire has cleared. He had on paper and in code every piece you would think a modern bureaucracy might ask for. But bureaucracies do not always operate by reason alone. They operate by narrative. And in this bank, the narrative had been set before the first keystroke. Young black boy, hoodie, wealth that seemed unearned. That story had provided an interpretive frame that Hutchinson and Davis could fit their actions into. When Officer Kim finally held the patent in her hand, she turned it under the light and read the tiny print. She made a call to a corporate number she had on her device. A calm voice on the other end of the line who requested a few identifiers. She checked the name on the patent against the TechVision contract. She compared the patent number with a public registry. On another line, she called the number listed for TechVision's legal team and left a message. She walked through the room with a deliberateness that suggested a different approach, one that believed facts mattered. Meanwhile, the live streamers were already editing. The clip of Hutchinson's initial command was being contrasted with the bank screen in a new video. The phrase, "Get your dirty hands off that counter," juxtaposed with, "Account balance, 2,400,000 jacqueries." The internet's logic is quick, montage is persuasive. Jamal felt pressure and relief at once. Pressure because proof does not unmake the very human thing of being judged in public. Relief because evidence existed, and might finally refract the room's attention. But the pivotal movement, the one that turned a humiliating morning into something with the energy to demand accountability, didn't happen with speeches. It happened with a single keystroke. Hutchinson, having reasserted himself by picking up the keyboard, refreshed the account screen. Maybe he expected error. Maybe he expected the numbers to dissolve like poorly choreographed theater. Instead, the numbers resolved into an unambiguous line item, and beneath it, the words that had been Jamal's name, Jamal Williams. For a beat that felt broken into slow frames, Hutchinson's smirk unraveled. It was a small unmaking. The theatricality fell away, and something like embarrassment and recalibration took its place. People in the lobby shifted their weight almost reflexively. The woman with the smartphone stopped speaking. Officer Davis's jaw tightened in a hard kind of neutrality. The bank's murmurs changed key. A viewer 2 blocks away, watching an early repost, would later say that the moment looked like recognition without explanation. The manager saw a name, and in that instant, he understood that this kid, whom he had quite publicly mocked, had a paper trail. He had proof. But what the manager saw was only half the picture. For Jamal, the manifestation of his name on the bank screen was both salvation and dissonance. It vindicated the long nights. It did not erase the humiliation. "Sir," Officer Kim said softly, holding up a printed exchange she had corroborated with the TechVision line. The timestamps matched the emails Jamal had shown. "I'm going to verify this through corporate channels, but on the face of it, this appears to be legitimate. It is worth holding here on verbs." Appears is a small important word that sits on the fulcrum between suspicion and correction. It is the kind of language bureaucracies use to move slowly toward accountability, without snapping the fragile threads of precedent. For Jamal, it was almost like hearing the world clear its throat before admitting a truth. Hutchinson's composure shuffled. He gathered his manager's ledger of excuses and used them like a fan to cover his blush. "We're doing what we have to do," he said. But something in his eyes had changed. The theater had been caught in the act. Phones continued to record. A dozen angles now existed. The clip of the smirk that met the screen would be framed as a teachable moment online. A single image of assumption suspended between a hoodie and a bank balance. "Everyone remained calm," Hutchinson said, voice less certain. He extended a hand as if to reclaim authority and found his audience uncertain. In the crowd, someone whispered, "That's the Williams family name." It was a mutter, speculative at first, the kind that spreads like pollination. But the name, Williams, is a common name, and yet in the room it became a cipher. Which Williams? What did Williams mean to Hutchinson, to the bank, to the people who worked there? No one in the room could say for certain, but the sound of a family name on a screen has social weight. In Hutchinson's face, there was a flicker that suggested recognition, not necessarily of a father or a history, but of the cultural freight names can carry. Jamal watched the transaction of people's faces as if observing a lesson in human speed. The laptop bag on the counter had been knocked, A corner creased when the security guard had scuffed past. The papers lay fanned like a deck. One of the documents, his printed patent, had a slight smear where the security guard's hand had clapped too quickly. It was an accidental vandalism, two faint gray smudges that could be swept away. Outside the bank, the city continued in its uncaring momentum. Inside, the gears of something larger had started to click. The smartphone clips flew. The pattern of indignity and refutation became a viral narrative with a pace of its own. That morning, what mattered most was that a single banal administrative display, a refresh of a teller's screen, had the power to alter the choreography of prejudice. The bank's system, designed to be indifferent, had unintentionally served as an instrument of truth. But truth in public is only the beginning. Recognition does not erase the marks left behind. It does not compensate for the waving of hands, the breathless interrogation, the hint of force. It does not stitch up the feeling a 13-year-old carries after being fished from his life and shown to a crowd. Jamal's mother held his hand in the moment of recalibration. She was small and steady, and when she saw the screen, she let out a breath she seemed to be holding for days. Anita, the little sister, had been kept at the edge of the lobby by a kindly teller, eyes wide and searching. To her, the scene was both a frayed carnival and a terrible education about the world's rapid hunger to judge and the slow machinery of proof. The first block of the morning had closed on a pivot. Hutchinson's arrogance had been punctured by an administrative fact. The phones had already begun to carry the sound of the eviction from dignity, then the counterpoint of validation. Yet, even as the room shifted, something else tightened. The presence of police, the formalization of suspicion into procedural steps, the fear that a wrong move could snap the thread of protection back into cruelty. Officer Davis, who had found confidence in the room for minutes, waited now as if holding a bone between his fingers to see how it would break. Hutchinson, now aware that the room's devices and the internet's witness might make a story of his actions, reached for the bank phone again. He called a compliance hotline and asked for corporate verification. He used new language: security breach, potential reputational risk. He asked for superior approval to proceed with the transaction. On the steps of the lobby, someone had started a chant, not a protest, not yet, but a low murmur of condemnation that had the feel of a community learning to speak. In a few days, that murmur would become a roar online. For now, it was a shifting of hearts and heads. Officer Kim moved toward Hutchinson, phone in hand, voice like glass. She had the patent registry open. She had the corporate legal number connected. She was doing the work that institutions sometimes forget, the messy labor of verification, checking boxes and calling the right number and reading the right letters until the alphabet made sense. In those minutes, with the bank's aisles full of the small sounds of a city on mundane repeat, the shape of things to come began to sketch itself in edges. There would be videos. There would be angry commentary. There would be headlines. But none of that was immediate. What was immediate was a 13-year-old boy feeling both seen and violated, and an institution with protocols and a public face trying, unevenly, to reconcile the two. Jamal, who had come that morning clutching papers like talismans, felt the edges of his world shift under the weight of other people's assumptions and the mechanical accuracy of numbers. The bank's marble did not soften, neither did the smirks fully recede. But in the interplay of light on a screen, and the sound of Hutchinson's mouth shaping a word he could no longer toss away without consequence, something had changed. A crowd member muttered about how quickly narratives shift on the web. A teller breathed a quiet apology to Jamal as she passed. A child who had been watching from beside the ATM looked up and asked his mother a question about fairness. The bank had become a small stage where the larger story of a city's priorities and prejudices played out in microcosm. And then, more people gathered and more phones recorded. The slow, relentless engine of circulation engaged. Somewhere, the first online comment about the clip, a curt sentence calling the manager out, received its first reply. The bank manager, who had thought himself the director of the day's script, suddenly found himself subject to an audience with a much larger reach. But at the heart of this immediate moment, Jamal and his mother were still there, their privacy splintered into a dozen feeds. They had proof, yes, but proof does not subtract the cost of being publicly stripped of dignity. It does not patch the bruise of being treated as suspicious simply because of how you look. Officer Kim's call confirmed what Jamal had. The patent number matched a public registry. TechVision's corporate number returned an automated message confirming a formal contract. The bank's internal system displayed a verified wire posting. The evidence fell into place like neat tiles. For a second, the room felt like a courtroom. For Jamal, it felt like a victory that tasted metallic and strange. Hutchinson's hands hovered above his keyboard, as though he could reconstruct his actions by rearranging his keystrokes. He looked at Jamal with something that mixed resentment and calculation. In another life, he might have been contrite and careful. In this one, he was calculating the cost. The click of the teller's keyboard and the hum of phones made a new kind of music in the lobby, one that would be carried beyond the bank's glass doors. It was a music turned emergent by the collision of bias and evidence, and the crowd was both the chorus and the audience. For Jamal, the morning would leave a line of memories. The smell of polished marble, the mechanical tone of Hutchinson's initial command, the weight of a hand on a patent, his mother's quiet hand on his shoulder, the flash of his name on a teller's screen. It would also leave something else, a question. He had seen what it took to be believed in public, not merely truth, but a proof that could be fetched and had a place on a bank's screen. He had felt the vulnerability of needing that proof to exist in front of strangers. He had seen how quickly the world could turn from scorn to tentative acknowledgement with the click of a key. And as the bank's internal line connected Hutchinson to corporate, as Officer Davis edged his stance into a posture of professional caution, as phones multiplied the image and the city's gossip moved like weather, there was a feeling that this morning was not simply a private humiliation. It was becoming a public story, messy, uneven, and liable to take on meanings that would outlast the morning light. Outside, the street remained indifferent in its rhythms. The bus rolled away, and the delivery truck's engine purred. But inside the glass, under the chandeliers that now seemed less ornamental and more like stage lights, an account name sat in plain font on a screen. It had cut a line through the choreography of assumption. The manager's smirk had vanished. The room hung in an expectant silence that tasted of consequence. And somewhere inside that silence, the small, steady fact remained. A 13-year-old had walked into a bank, carried proof of a fortune he had earned in the quiet of nights, and had been met with suspicion until the ledger told a story he had already lived. There were calls to corporate waiting in the queue. There were people whose social feeds would decide how the morning was narrated. There were 2 police officers in the lobby, each poised differently. There was a security guard who had artfully managed the scene. And there was a boy named Jamal Williams, hands still trembling, feeling the world tilt in ways he had never imagined. When the teller's screen refreshed again, and the word Williams glowed in the same impartial font as the balance, Hutchinson's mouth worked like someone tasting an unfamiliar word. He reached for his phone. He spoke into it in the clipped language of managerial defense. What happened next would not be about the numbers alone. It would be about how institutions move when their mistakes are visible, about how people apologize or defend, about the speed of cameras and the slowness of justice. It would be about reputations and investigations and the messy accountability that follows public exposure. But in the hush that immediately followed the revelation, as phones kept recording and as the bank's internal systems whispered their confirmations, Jamal listened to a different sound, the small, stubborn beat of his own breathing, steadying as if to mark a beginning. He drew a quieter breath, one that tried to rearrange the morning into something sensible. For a child who had learned to corral numbers and coax logic out of silence, the world had suddenly become stubbornly human, messy, reactive, and loud. If you want the full deep dive into how this one moment unfolded into a national reckoning, subscribe. This episode stays with the evidence. Officer Davis stepped back as if the numbers on the screen had shifted the gravity of his role. He radioed his sergeant again, voice clipped. Backup requested for a crowd. His hand hovered near the holster in a way that betrayed the tension of someone recalculating a script he had rehearsed 100 times. Officer Kim continued to speak in lists and confirmations, calm and methodical, reading off patent digits and email timestamps like a translator decoding between languages. Outside the bank, the footage had already escaped. The first post, shaky, breathy, a handheld clip that began with Hutchinson's command and ended on the teller screen, hit a neighborhood forum and then a local news desk within an hour. By the time a producer in the city's morning studio cued the clip during an early broadcast, the number of views had ticked into the millions. 24 hours later, the clip had become a compact narrative. A manager's smirk, a screen that refused to lie, a child whose dignity had been stripped, and then, awkwardly, partially restored by a bank interface. The internet has peculiar tastes. It trades in sharp contrasts and shareable indignation. In this case, the geometry was simple and persuasive. The audio of the manager's humiliation looped against the sterile certificate of a patent. The phrase, "Get your dirty hands off that counter," played over a font that read, plainly, Jamal Williams. People felt outrage in their bones and pressed share. Within 48 hours, the video had been watched tens of millions of times. Hashtags multiplied and folded into op-eds. Tech circles cheered quietly for the child who had cracked an algorithm and earned what he had. Civil rights groups called for investigations. Local organizers gathered outside branches in solidarity. The bank's corporate inbox filled with messages demanding answers. Journalists called Jamal's neighborhood to ask questions his mother had not expected to have to answer. Sterling Trust's PR team moved as one would expect a well-polished bureaucracy to move. Statements, expressions of concern, promises to review. The bank's senior vice president of retail, Victoria Lane, appeared on the line within a morning. Her voice in press releases was measured. The language of corporate apology is practiced, legal by necessity. But measured statements could not erase the recording of a manager's words. Public pressure grew as more angles of the clip emerged, capturing each inflection. Victoria Lane visited the branch 2 days later. She walked with a clipboard and a staffer, whose role it was to catalog details. She saw the footage the public had seen, the live posts, and then she saw the bank's internal logs, the compliance notes, the call to the fraud hotline, Hutchinson's own ticket to corporate. She listened as staff gave different accounts, some defensive, some ashamed, some merely procedural, and then she listened to Jamal and his mother. Her arrival had an institutional feel, a woman in a tailored suit trying to make a human thing into a management action. She did what such a person does when a local incident becomes an organizational crisis. She suspended employees pending an internal review. She ordered the retention of all security footage and communication logs. She sent a terse public apology that did not quite meet the crater of the morning's harm, and she announced an external review. These were standard moves, and they were necessary. They were not, however, sufficient to satisfy a public that had watched the wound on loop. Meanwhile, legal and civic actors began to parse whether the incident crossed the threshold from misjudgment to civil rights violation. Within a week, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division publicly confirmed that it had opened an inquiry into the bank's conduct and into the police involvement. The name on the filing was Sandra Morrison. She transmitted the weight of government oversight without melodrama. Her team requested documents, internal policies, training modules, the compliance call recordings, and Hutchinson's personnel file. Investigations accelerate on different tempos. Social outrage hums fast. Federal processes move slower. Yet the combination of recorded humiliation, the bank's internal memos, and the viral spread created a pressure that pulled institutional gears forward. When the DOJ's letter arrived at Sterling Trust's legal office, the bank's in-house counsel could no longer treat the incident as merely an employee management problem. It had become a systemic question about how a bank's frontline practices intersected with race and youth. Officer Davis was placed on administrative leave pending an internal affairs inquiry. Hutchinson, too, was moved to administrative status as the bank's review proceeded. The security guard, Frank Morrison, whose hand had carelessly scuffed a corner of Jamal's laptop bag, faced disciplinary review for his conduct. The photographs and video that showed the guard grasping the paper would be scrutinized. Intent is a slippery thing, but conduct is easier to observe. Court notices followed. Civil attorneys reached out to Jamal's family with offers of representation. Activist groups put the family in touch with counselors and fundraisers. A pattern unfolded that many who watched recognized from other stories. A private humiliation became a public cause. But public causes require careful personal decisions. Jamal's mother, protective and practical, paced through options and weighed the cost of legal entanglement. She had spent nights working double shifts to keep the lights on. She understood reputations as currency that could be dangerous to spend. The courtroom, when it came, felt both too little and unnecessarily large. Testimony is an awkward instrument. It forces private things into a public script, where tone and memory bend under cross-examination. Judge Margaret Reeves presided over the civil suit that would argue institutional responsibility, claims of racial humiliation, negligence, and damages for emotional distress. The defense unsurprisingly framed the bank's actions as adherence to fraud protocols, emphasizing uncertainty in the duty to prevent financial crime. In the public gallery sat a mixture of local residents, activists, and curious onlookers who had come to see how the law would reconcile recorded cruelty with procedural obligation. The room smelled like court buildings do, old wood and bleach and cautious hope. There were documents placed carefully on tables, email trails that showed TechVision's offer, the wire confirmation, the patent filing, internal compliance chats where Hutchinson had called for verification. There were also messages from the bank's internal training modules that showed, in carefully framed language, guidance about handling suspicion and engaging law enforcement. Witnesses took the stand. Jamal's mother spoke with the deliberate economy of someone explaining the impossible, the daily logistics of their life, and the stakes of dignity. Jamal himself, asked to recount the morning, described details with the specificity of memory. The sound of the manager's words, the scuff across the corner of his patent, the way his name looked on a fluorescent screen. He was 13 when he testified, and his voice sometimes quavered, but there was an unmistakable steadiness under it, the steadiness of a person who had long organized evidence into a narrative that could convince machines and humans alike. Officer Davis testified, and his testimony contained those small things that reveal posture, how he had perceived risk, what training had taught him, what cues he had followed. Cross-examination probed the gap between instinct and protocol. Hutchinson's testimony was defensive and rehearsed. At times he seemed to be speaking for a system more than himself, the language of policy as armor. The central piece of the case was not only that evidence existed, but that it had been willfully dismissed, in performance, in front of a crowd. Jurors watched the original clips looped back at them. They saw the arc, command, public derision, refresh, visible name, and a slow, flailing attempt at recovery. A recorded pattern, when replayed in a courtroom and coupled with emails demonstrating a failure to follow inclusive, non-discriminatory practices, became a story rigid enough to be judged. Outside, demonstrations surged in sympathy with Jamal. People who had never set foot inside the branch gathered to hold signs and to collect stories about similar humiliations. They demanded that banks change training and that police re-examine protocols about involving youth. They chanted about dignity and asked why a child in a hoodie had met the world's suspicion sooner than he had met its curiosity. The bank, for its part, announced a package of reforms in response to the scandal. Some of the measures were immediate. Mandatory bias awareness training at all branch levels, stricter limits on when law enforcement is called for suspected fraud against minors, and a review of frontline managerial accountability. The bank pledged to cooperate with the DOJ and to fund community outreach programs that encouraged fair access to financial services. Critics called some reforms performative. Supporters argued that even performative beginnings could solidify into real change. Legal settlement discussions ran in parallel with litigation. Sterling Trust's legal team weighed the costs, both financial and reputational, of a drawn-out trial. Jamal's representation pushed for redress not only for damages, but for systemic commitments. A fund dedicated to youth financial education, an independent audit of branch practices, and support for programs that would reduce the likelihood of young innovators being denied access to their earnings. In the end, the bank agreed to a settlement that included compensation for Jamal and funding for community initiatives, along with commitments to policy changes and public transparency reports regarding branch-level interactions. The terms of the settlement were negotiated away from cameras, the way difficult things often are. For Jamal and his mother, the settlement provided breathing room, money that could be used to stabilize their home and to invest in Jamal's future endeavors. But money did not erase the memory of being shown to a crowd. It did, however, create resources that allowed Jamal to continue learning, to pay for college applications, and, eventually, a visit to an engineering program that would change the trajectory of his life. Officer Davis faced an internal administrative process as well as the scrutiny of the DOJ. He was disciplined in ways that were documented in public filings. The bank updated its law enforcement engagement policies. Hutchinson was dismissed from his post for conduct that the bank said violated standards of customer treatment and escalatory behavior. Frank Morrison's discipline included mandated retraining and supervisory review. Those outcomes were cataloged in press releases and in local headlines that marked the end of a chapter for the bank staff who had been at the center of the incident. But accountability in public life is never as neat as headlines suggest. For Jamal, the aftermath included nights when he resisted going outside, when the sensation of thousands of eyes felt like weather pressing down. He spoke with a counselor about the shame and anger that visited him. Therapy helped him re-establish a baseline of confidence, to remember why he worked on code in the first place. He also learned to lean on community, mentors from TechVision and local organizations who encouraged his studies and helped make introductions to scholarship committees. News outlets sought updates, and the story evolved into a broader conversation about racial profiling in financial services and about how institutions treat young people with wealth that upends stereotypes. Panel discussions asked banking executives whether their training sufficiently prepared frontline staff to avoid bias. Tech conferences featured Jamal as a speaker once he was older, a young prodigy who wanted not only to be admired for technical skill, but to be heard regarding the social responsibilities of platforms that distribute visibility and power. As months passed, Jamal's life took shape in ways he had once only imagined during cold nights of coding. His acceptance letters stacked up. One university, an institution known for its engineering program, extended an offer that recognized both his technical work and the national attention his story had garnered. That acceptance came with scholarship assistance that ensured the practicalities would not be an obstacle. There were internships, too, where he could continue to sharpen code and to work on projects that interested him. Machine learning models that helped small businesses detect fraud with nuance rather than blunt instruments. The $2.4 million that had appeared in his account was, in time, structured in a way that supported family stability and investment in his work. TechVision continued to honor the licensing agreement as the legal dust settled, and Jamal went on to file follow-up patents and to refine his initial algorithm into applications that bore the fingerprints of his early nights hunched over a laptop. He retained control of his intellectual property and eventually formed a small company that worked on accessible surveillance optimization, technology that prioritized privacy and fairness rather than the blunt profit motives that often drive similar systems. A few years later, Jamal established a foundation, Dignity and Finance Initiative. Its stated mission was simple and close to his experience: to provide resources to young innovators from under-resourced communities, to educate youth on financial access, and to lobby for bank policies that treat minors with care. The foundation funded workshops that taught basic financial literacy alongside coding boot camps. It provided grants to schools for equipment and worked with legal aid organizations to create pro bono supports for young entrepreneurs. The incident that had once been a clip spread across screens became a case study in corporate training modules. Bank branches updated their intake protocols. If a minor presented documentation of cleared funds and legal paperwork, the policy now required escalation to a central review rather than an on-the-spot call to police. New lines were drawn in training manuals about when to involve law enforcement, a change small in linguistic scope but large in real-life consequence. Policy conversations moved beyond the bank's four walls. Legislators proposed bills aimed at protecting minors in financial transactions and at requiring clearer standards before law enforcement could be engaged in suspected financial crimes involving youth. The proposals vary in scope and status. Some stalled, others led to incremental reforms at state levels. The public conversation had been energized. The story had exposed a common pattern and demanded a response. Jamal testified before a panel of lawmakers about his experience. He spoke plainly in a room filled with microphones and cameras. He described the strange intimacy of being publicly humiliated and the feeling of being believed only when a database agreed with him. He argued that dignity cannot be an occasional courtesy. It must be a baseline enforced by policy and practice. His testimony was not theatrical. It was a clear articulation of what it meant to be young, black, and skilled in a world that still read hoodies as threats. Years later, when asked about the moment the manager had seen his last name on the screen, Jamal was measured. He never claimed that one flicker of recognition excused the earlier cruelty. What the surname did, he said, was expose a cruel paradox. The same cultural scripts that made a hoodie threatening were also infused with assumptions about family names and social belonging. The name Williams, when presented in a ledger, did not reveal a father. It revealed the fact that a name can unlock credibility in a system that otherwise prefers suspicion. That revelation left him conflicted, grateful that the name read on a screen could create safety, but frustrated that the system had required that proof in the first place. The viral clip continued to live in the public imagination. It was used in classrooms to teach about bias. It was referenced in ethics panels to discuss the intersection of surveillance technology and social prejudice. Journalists revisited the story on anniversaries, asking follow-up questions about whether reforms had taken root. For every measure that stuck, there were reminders of how much work remained. Many doors still closed for those who lacked Jamal's visibility. Many neighborhoods remained under-resourced. Many managers had not faced a viral moment to spur change. Jamal's personal arc did not end at reparations and policies. He grew into his career with a slow, deliberate hunger to build systems that required less of people in the way of proving their lives. He helped design user interfaces that made verification equitable and unobtrusive. He taught workshops where he encouraged younger coders to consider the social outcomes of their code, a line of ethics that is easy to say and harder to implement. He also learned, painfully, that visibility is double-edged. The attention that protected him also chased him. Interviews lived long on the web. Critics suggested he had used his story for fame. Supporters accused critics of minimizing the harm he had faced. He navigated the strange economy of being both a private person and a public symbol. Through it all, his mother remained an anchor, pragmatic and blunt-eyed about what the publicity bought and what it cost. A turning point came not in a courtroom but in a classroom. Jamal visited a local high school where students crowded around computers and cameras, lighting up at the idea that someone from their neighborhood had written code that mattered. He spoke about patents, what they protect and what they do not, and about the necessity of safeguarding dignity in everyday transactions. A student raised a hand and asked, "What do we do when there's no camera? When no one is there to see it?" Jamal's answer was the distilled ethic of his later years. He spoke of building systems that do not require spectacle to be fair. He spoke of training humans to recognize bias. He spoke of legal standards that create default protections for minorities and youth. And he spoke of community, people teaching one another how to document their work, how to keep records, how to build networks of witnesses that do not depend on strangers with phones. If no camera is there, he said, then the system has to work without witness. That's what we push for. That's what changed for us. And that's what we try to give others. 10 years after the bank lobby, Jamal sat on a bus that cut through his old neighborhood. He felt older in ways that were not only chronological. The sun slanted through the bus window over his forearm, and he watched the city pass like a strip of moving film. He had been to auditoriums and boardrooms. He had been to protests. He had been to meetings where policy language made promises that sometimes stretched and sometimes stuck. He had watched managers change their scripts in training videos. He had seen officers take different classes. Some of that was incremental and good. Some of it still felt performative and fragile. A little girl on the bus tied her shoe beside his knee, and he felt again that old fierce protectiveness. He thought about the moments that stitched together his life. The glow of a laptop, the smell of oatmeal in a small kitchen, the weight of his mother's hand. He thought about a teller screen that had refused to lie. He thought about a manager whose smirk cracked when letters and numbers refused to conform to his prejudice. He took out his phone and watched for a second the clip that had started so much. He did not loiter in anger. He watched it as a document, like someone checking a map. The manager's voice existed in the clip as a reminder. The screen with his name existed as an instrument of truth. The interplay between them was where the story lived. He had learned to live with complexity. Vindication is not the end of harm. Visibility is rarely a universal remedy. Still, he had a fierce, practical hope. The settlement had allowed him to continue his work. The foundation had funded classrooms and legal clinics. Policies had changed in small but meaningful ways. The bank had updated its manuals. Officers had a new checklist that foregrounded verification over suspicion when minors presented documentation. He thought, too, about people who never had cameras pointed at them. The moral question that haunted him, and that he turned to the viewers now, was not about punishment. It was about attention. Who will we believe when there's no looped clip? Who will stand up for a dignity that is not trending? He folded the phone into his pocket and spoke, not to the city, but to the slow possibility of change. He spoke the sentences he had practiced for years, the ones that carried both a confession and a demand. That dignity required more than apology. That policy required more than performative statements. That communities needed resources to document their achievements and to protect their work. And if you see something like this, he said quietly, don't just record it, act. Call someone who can help. Demand transparency. Teach your kids how to keep records. Support laws that protect youth access to their earnings. The camera helped me, but we need systems that protect everyone even when no one's watching. The bus slowed and stopped. People filed off and into their days. Jamal stood with an ordinary sort of calm. He had learned to channel bruises into building. He had a company that paid attention to privacy, a foundation to fund programs, and friends who remembered the nights they'd traded code for cheap pizza. He had also learned that change often required enormous patience and practical persistence. At the end of the day, the manager's smirk remained a small, sharp image that taught the public something about how quickly assumptions translate into action. The ledger that displayed his name remained a small, banal instrument that reminded people that systems can also protect. Jamal folded both into his life and worked to steer the world toward the latter. If this story moved you, share it. If you've seen something like this, tell your story in the comments. And consider supporting educational and legal resources that help young innovators protect their work and their dignity. Witnessing is not enough. Change takes action. In the months and years that followed, the case that began with a single humiliating command became more than a headline. It became a set of small changes, a foundation, policy proposals, and a reminder that while cameras can expose injustice, a better world is built when systems default to fairness. Jamal Williams kept coding, he kept teaching, he kept asking a single steady question of every institution he met. Who do you protect, and by what right? He never invented a father to explain what his last name meant. No additional family history was needed. The name on the teller's screen, Williams, had been, for a moment, the hinge between suspicion and provisional belief. What mattered afterward was not the provenance of a name, but the obligation systems had to treat people with dignity, irrespective of the presence of spectacle. He thought of that small bus stop, of the child tying her shoe, and felt a fierce benediction toward the ordinary work of life. That someone will teach her to document her achievements. That someone will show her how to fight for her place at a counter without ever losing her sense of self. That is the change he hoped his morning at the bank would multiply. Not only that one manager would be held to account, but that institutions would be rewritten to default to humanity. He stepped off the bus into the folding light and walked home. The city did not change all at once, but when he turned a corner, he saw a flyer taped to a community board advertising a free coding class sponsored by a local bank, a small practical thing that now carried a different shade of possibility. He smiled and kept walking toward the work he had chosen, making systems that, when they display names and numbers, do not become instruments of humiliation, but tools of fairness. If you want to see more stories like this and learn how to support young people who face discrimination, subscribe and share. If this chapter left you thinking about dignity and evidence, tell someone. The work of change starts with attention and continues with action.